Hello, I'm David McCann. Welcome to Decisions Across Borders. We are a show about behavioral science as it's applied in countries around the world to make businesses and technology work better for customers and for employees. Today, I'm joined by Cole Armstrong. Cole is the MD and founder of Neurospot, a behavioral insights agency based in Auckland, New Zealand. Cole has worked with a range of New Zealand's leading organizations covering fields such as retail, supermarkets, financial services, and utilities, where he applies a behavioral science lens to customer and user experiences. He has a diverse background in academia, commerce, and the public sector. He's worked with companies in New Zealand, in Africa, in Europe, and in the Middle East. And his perspective is simply this: behavioral science allows organizations to more effectively identify why people do what they do and then set in motion a set of evidence-based strategies that help deliver better organizational outcomes. So, Cole, thanks so much for coming on and joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, David. I really appreciate being asked to have a chat with you.
Well, fabulous. So, at first, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to talk a little bit about e-commerce. I think in our current climate, it's probably the hotter topic. Um, You've talked several times about small frustrations in a shopping experience being enough to help a customer abandon and go to a different competitor or a different company. Can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say it's not just about frustration. Um, and the reason I say that is because I think if we focus purely on frustration, often we miss some really big opportunities to improve an experience and actually to retain customers. Um, so, for example, it could be outside of frustration. Do people even see what you want them to see? And amongst the projects that I've done, one of the I guess the biggest findings I've found is how often people will land on your site or even take it into a store environment. How often people will walk into a store and actually not notice that specific element or that specific offer or that specific feature that you want them to see. And I think one of the key points to make is if somebody doesn't see it, then they don't, then it might as well not even exist. Um, Now, the other point to say before we talk about points of friction and frustration is when we reframe the conversation into opportunities, we can start to think about the reinforcement to get people to coming back. And this is where you start driving customer retention and retain, customer loyalty. So, for example, somebody who gets onto your site and doesn't find something that they want is unlikely to come back again. Um, and I think this is where, in this COVID environment, it becomes really interesting. We've got an opportunity to disrupt behaviors. We know that people are trialing new ways of shopping and purchasing. They're trialing new brands, new store environments. But are they going to stay there? I mean, that's where I think the most successful brands are actually being quite proactive to see what they are doing, which is going to entice and excite a customer and keep them coming back and again, not just assuming that because they're online they might necessarily benefit from this whole sad ordeal. But when we talk about frustrations, I guess probably the easiest way to identify these is literally to start looking at the data you have, looking at the feedback you've got. So, for example, um, when you start noticing there are customers in certain types of situations dropping off, or they're dropping off on certain pages, that's obviously suggests that there's a problem there. It doesn't tell you what that problem is, but it tells you where it is. And I think that's a really good start. Another the the other point is, I mean, most organisations are sitting on lots of feedback information. We've all, think of a number of retailers that have a little pop-up that says, rate our service or, give us some feedback. Um, I suspect there's plenty of organizations which have kind of got these themes floating around. So they've got an idea around what they need to do. They just aren't necessarily doing the right thing with it. And that leads to the final point, which is that if you take getting customer feedback, verbal feedback, what they tell you is fantastic. Like, you shouldn't dismiss it, but it should not be the only thing you look at, and it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Um, and to give you an idea, I once did some testing for a client, and amongst other things, we just recorded what these customers did in 4 different environments. So my client's store and then 3 other stores. And one of the things I remember is asking them at the end, which one was easiest and which one was quickest to complete. So which brand were you able to do what you wanted to do quickest? And it turns out that the environment that was perceived to be quickest was by far and away the longest experience of all of them, by about 50% longer than my client's store experience. So, and I guess where that led us to was, so my client had taken the view of, okay, we need to make the journey as short as possible, get them to where they want to be as quickly as possible, remove the friction that sits in that experience. And actually, that was the wrong that was the wrong thing to do. They had a competitor who was doing a much better job at making people feel like they were getting a better experience. They were feeling like customers were feeling that they had a more reliable provider. And I think that's where you need to be really mindful that what people say and what people do differ. And that's where I think a behavioral science lens becomes really useful for when you're developing your online store presence.
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, as you're talking, I think, well, most of us would know the classic example of longer journey being more enjoyable and having us come back regularly, which is IKEA. I mean, they're
Mm.
famous for that. People love going back to that store. Well, let me rephrase this. At least half the marital couple love going back to the IKEA.
But you're right. I mean, and I guess this is where I almost feel like there's 2 different points. There's positive friction and negative friction. IKEA does a fantastic job of, they take they take some of your time, but in return they give you something of value, and that to me is a very positive experience. But it's also positive friction. There's points along that journey that stop you and make you engage and make you think and make you experience something. And great, that's what people are there for. They want to give up some of their time for something, and for something that they value.
Mm.
um, Now, that doesn't mean that you should always increase someone's journey times. It just means that you've got to be a bit mindful of the quality of it, and what you're taking in return.
So I just want to come back to one point that you raised, which was company will know, let's say that there's a page that's the problem. Can you help without necessarily spending loads of money? Can you help a business narrow down on that page what the problem might be?
Mm. I think there's a few things you can do. One is literally is to go in with some really good evidence-informed hypotheses. And this is where you're going to hear me say this again later. Look into behavioral science, um, and saying, look, from a behavioral science lens, looking at the site, what do we think might be motivating somebody to drop out? Or what do we think might be causing this frustration? Or what do we know about how people engage with certain page layouts? Um, so, for example, if we know that there's some very typical eye tracking patterns on a site. Now, you want to make the most important, that suggests that you need to make the most important item appear at the point at which people are most likely to see it. If somebody has to look in a very unusual part of the site to complete what they want to do, well, they'll probably drop out. So so what you can do is go, okay, based upon what we've learned from other sites, from other studies, from other research, from other stores, what do we think might happen? And then you can test an experiment, and this is where A/B testing becomes really important, because you can literally say, well, best hypothesis suggests option A should have worked. What does the data say? Yes or no? And then you can move on from there. But the other But if you want to go a bit deeper and you actually want to think a little bit more carefully around how people engage with your site, and to be honest, I think the payoff from this type of approach is normally outweighs the costs. Um, is it might be as simple as doing some basic UX testing, which is literally getting users in and trialing it. But don't just get them to trial it. Trial it while you're recording what they're doing. So record how they engage with your site, but also record where they're looking on that screen. Because going back to my point before, it might be, and quite often I'm finding it is, that the important information is just not where it's supposed to be, or there's something else which is pulling people's attention, or it's not clear what people are supposed to be doing. And often I think your eyes and your attention patterns can point to what is going on. So I think there's a couple of really good, simple approaches there that you could use.
Those are all very solid. So let's transition from the e-com to the traditional brick and mortar retailer. I know you and I have had some amazing conversations around the work that you've done in this space. And I think the the special technology that you're talking about, you just mentioned, is the eye tracking technology. So, are you able to talk about why a retailer would want to use that type of technology and have that kind of testing done if they're trying to improve, uh, let's just say, some problem that they face or solve for something?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, just for anybody who's not aware of what I'm talking about here. So one of the really interesting bits of technology that's been around for a number of years is essentially is eye tracking. And you can use this in a fixed environment, so for website testing, or you can use it in an in-store environment through a set of specialized glasses. And what these glasses do is they record where you're looking, so roughly where your gaze is, but it can also record where in particular within that view you're paying attention to. So right now I'm looking at my screen. Now I could be looking at David's face, or I could be looking at the photo over his right shoulder. Now we can record that, and that gives a really nice perspective on how people are engaging with that store environment, or that website environment that they can't articulate. I think that's the important thing. It gets to a perspective on people's behavior that they don't always know is happening. And to give you a good example of where this really came to light for me, um, about a year ago, I did a study in a retail environment where I sent people around a physical store with a pair of eye tracking glasses. And as soon as they came out, I pulled them aside, took the glass off them, and said, "Okay, so tell me, where did you go?" And often they would say, "I went to, section A, B, and C." And then I'd play them the video, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, but I also went to X, Y, and Z." And it's like, this is within a space of 5 minutes of leaving the store. I mean, they just clean forgotten. So I think that, and that's a very big detail to forget. You think of all the smaller details that people are unlikely to be aware of. So, did they see the signage within your store? Were they noticing the specials? Were they noticing how items complement each other? Um, so there's a lot of really useful, interesting things that a retailer can, or somebody with a physical store presence can take away that suggests what they should do to improve and optimize their store experience. And this works really nicely alongside things like, a lot of retailers have done shop-alongs and customer interviews. Those aren't without value, but this provides a slightly different perspective which can complement that.
Yeah, it certainly speaks to how fallible our memories are. I think many of us don't realize the amount of information that we absorb in a day versus the amount that we retain and can recall are certainly not the same thing. So
Mm.
this type of insight, have you found that it's able to, when you run experiments with this type of insight, is it able to positively influence things like basket size or repeat shopping?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a few commercial elements which we'll keep off the table here today. But um, I guess what it does is it points to when you start off with it points to two things. One is it points to what might be going on with a customer's particular a retailer's particular challenges, and we've found that I've had some really good examples where my clients have been able to make some very simple changes and get some really quite good returns off the back of that. But the other thing is that also, if you use it properly, you can also start to identify new opportunities that you weren't necessarily aware of. And I think those are the really exciting ones for me, because those are the things that people might not have been talking about beforehand, but suddenly you've got all this really nice footage from the customer's point of view that you can use to influence the decisions of key stakeholders within the organization. So whether how you set up your shelves within the store, how you utilize signage, and so on.
There are plenty of opportunities to help us be, let's just say, better shoppers, plenty of opportunities to help our customers find what they want and enjoy what they're doing while they're doing it. I love the potential of eye tracking technology to make for better in-store and online experiences. So, Cole, thank you so much for coming and telling us about how this stuff works and sharing some of your perspectives. If there was people on the listening to the video that wanted to reach out to you and ask you questions directly, what would you recommend that they do?
Well, probably three ways. You can find me. My website is www.neurospot.co.nz. But honestly, send me an email at cole@neurospot.co.nz, or reach out to me on LinkedIn, which is I think is a fantastic way of keeping in touch with who's doing what within this really exciting industry.
Well, fabulous. I'll post the links to your website and maybe your email address above in the comments. But once again, Cole, thank you so much. Have an awesome rest of the day.
Thanks for having me on here. I really appreciate it, David.